Hey everybody, today we're going to be talking about fantasy football sleepers. Remember everybody, I write the Fantasy Football Almanac and Draft Guide, 250 pages of awesome, obsessive compulsive, you could say, fantasy football just goodness. But one of the things I do in my draft guide that's a little bit different than everybody else is isolate sleepers based on mathematics and based on scouting. And when I say scouting, I mean scouting for fantasy football, actually watching all of the games. Yes, I watch all of the games. I watch all of the preseason games. I put in a ton of work. That's why this almanac is 250 pages purely of rankings in fantasy football analytics, fantasy football information. There's not a lot of fluff in there. It's basically all information. But what I wanted to do for everybody watching this video is outline kind of basically the secrets that I use to find fantasy football sleepers and basically unearth them. Like I said, a lot of this is mathematical. I put a proprietary algorithm together to unearth these guys. It's proven over time. But again, let's just go into some of the more practical stuff. So step one, keep track of average draft position. And the reason this is super important is because you know that when you start to research fantasy football sleepers, there are sleepers that come out in May, then June, then July, then August, and late into August, right? And there are all these articles. They go sleepers, they go deep sleepers, all this stuff. And what you find is site over site, whether you're on ESPN, like one of the big ones, Fantasy Pros, which I love, Fantasy Pros, whatever you read, what ends up happening is these blogs, stuff gets tweeted out. People start picking up the same sleepers over and over again. And that doesn't help your team. And what happens over time, when I say keep track of average draft position, is if a sleeper is posted in an article that was written in May, look where their average draft position is. Let's take one, for example, of recent years is Rashad Penny, a player that I could not stand. And I'll talk more about that in a while. But when people start talking about Rashad Penny, and then another big publication picks him up, and then another one picks him up, what ends up happening is the hype train builds. And over time, the average draft position goes from like round, 10 or 12 or something like that, and it sneaks into the single digit rounds. At that point, they're not a sleeper anymore. They're just a player being drafted. And I would argue with Rashad Penny's case, a player that was overdrafted. So keeping track over the offseason of where their average draft position is, super important for sleepers. The next one on the list here, have a reason and not a hunch. And again, I'm going to talk about kind of the mass distribution and why really I started writing the Fantasy Football Almanac is I felt like a lot of these sleepers and these deep sleepers that were, supposed to be picked in the middle and the late rounds, a lot of these guys were based on one popular guy in a very widely distributed website, online article, publication, whatever. One person had a hunch and they made a compelling case, and then the next person picks it up, and then the next person. It turns into hive mind. It turns into a bee, right? You have the queen bee set in the course, and you have all the drones saying, yeah, pumping that message out. So when I say have a reason, look, if somebody makes a compelling case, that's great. But that's a lot of times not based on math, not based on scouting. It's based on somebody's hunch. And good fantasy football players, they have a lot of hunches, and they played those hunches. And the more successful ones have the great publication, the great distribution. So, they do have some gravitas in terms of, the fantasy football community. But it's important for you not just to take that verbatim. Go in and research that. What are the things? What are the factors going into this? And really isolate that. Don't play somebody else's hunch, right? If you're going to make a mistake in a draft, make your own mistake. Don't make somebody else's mistakes. Have a reason. The next one on the list here is analyze the offense, and this is part of this have a reason point of view that I have. If you analyze the offense, you should know the offensive scheme, the basic offensive scheme, right? A great example of this is Greg Roman throughout his career as an offensive coordinator. He's the offensive coordinator for the Baltimore Ravens at this point. He will run a read option, or he'll let his quarterbacks run. It's no secret. It was no surprise to me and readers in my almanac last year that Lamar Jackson was going to break out because quarterbacks that can get you rushing yards in volume are always valuable, right? So Lamar Jackson, we predicted last year Lamar Jackson. A lot of my readers got him, in the double-digit rounds and won their league based on that pick alone. And the reason we identified that is because we knew kind of what this offensive scheme was going to do. Now, you can just go high level. You could go to, like a team rankings, like a statistical service. You could even go to ESPN or fantasy. You look at the projected offense and see where where they're going to go, their run versus pass. Pro Football Reference is another great one, right? See their run to pass ratio, see what these offensive coaches generally do. That's a really high level thing that everybody can do today. Another thing that I'll say, and I'll go to step 4 here, is analyze the competition. So the offenses, what I do, by the way, is a lot more intense. Before I kind of move on to point 4 here, what I do with the offense is I actually watch every game. Like I said, I put over 1,000 hours a year into watching NFL film. You see this little set behind me with all the NFL helmets. I'm a nut. I'm crazy. I had these. This isn't a set for my YouTube station or anything like that. I've had these helmets for a while just because I'm a dork and I like to every week, put the helmets in the position that they are in the division and keep track of the division standings that way. Like I said, I'm a dork, right? And I'm into it. And so if you're going to buy like a fantasy football guide, this fantasy football almanac, you want it written by a dork that puts in 1,000 hours watching games to plot plays. And as I'm watching the games, I plot the plays and I isolate matchups. That's what I do. It's an insane amount of preparation. But again, there are websites that you can pick up some of these things. Now, in terms of analyzing the competition, what you want to do is look at the depth of the teams, right? There are always threats. There are always threats to jobs. And I was talking about Rashad Penny a little bit earlier, and I always laughed, right? Rashad Penny had earlier draft position than Chris Carson in Seattle. And I came out and, I watched the film and I was like, geez, Chris Carson's way better than Rashad Penny. Especially for the fit for the Seattle Seahawks offense and what Schottenheimer want to do and the offensive coordinator behind him. And I was like, my eyes are telling me that Chris Carson is going to win the job. Then you look at the press and you say, well, gosh, all the press is saying that Chris Carson is going to win this job. And so when I put this out there and I'm like, hey, you should probably be looking at Chris Carson in the later rounds because it looks like he's going to be the winner of the job, I got universally laughed at because that wasn't the popular opinion at the time, right? It's hive mind. And people are like, oh, Chris Carson, look at this idiot, blah, blah, blah. And it's not, that I was able to, be right and everybody else is wrong. Certainly I'm wrong sometimes. But the point here, and the point that I'm trying to make is, look, if it's obvious on film, and outside of quarterback, mind you, if there's a number 1 overall quarterback pick, pick number 1 in the draft, he's going to start regardless if he sucks or not, okay? Josh Rosen has gotten a few starts in the NFL for 2 different teams, for crying out loud, right? If it's a quarterback, they'll start. But if it's a running back, they're pretty easily replaced. Philip Lindsay, right? Everybody's talking about Royce Freeman. Philip Lindsay came out and disrupted that in Denver. Now we have Melvin Gordon there, right? Running backs are easily replaced. So, and running backs are so important in fantasy football, as you know. So you need to analyze that competition. You need to keep track of the competition. It's not all about draft position. It's more about, how the player is going to fit. And another thing is if you're looking for that PPR back, that third down back that gets receptions, you need to know whether or not he can pick up a blitz. Because a running back that is supposed to be a pass receiving threat, if he can't pick up the blitz, he's not getting on the field. So you need to pay attention to these things. Again, this is all stuff that I do in this beautiful book that takes me months to write, the Fantasy Football Almanac and Draft Guide. So if you're looking for something more intense, like a methodology that's a lot more intense, a lot more hours, maybe you don't have that kind of time to be as obsessive, compulsive, and weird, downright weird like I am, buy the book. It's like $15. It's actually like $14.97 or something, depending on when you pick it up. And it might even be on sale. So check it out on Amazon below. The last one here, analyze the history, right? Analyze the performance. And I'll use the last year Le'Veon Bell. That's the first thing that comes to my mind, right? Le'Veon Bell, he spends 1 year jet skiing, while he was holding out from the Pittsburgh Steelers, gets traded to signs with the New York Jets. Not a great fit. If you look at historically at Adam Gase systems, not great. Another one is Devonta Freeman. When Dirk Cutter went to Atlanta, not a great fit because Dirk Cutter doesn't utilize the running backs like we all as NFL fans expect a coach to use a running back. So it's a little bit different. You do need to analyze kind of the historical performances. If you don't do that, then you don't really know, is this player degrading? Is this player on the up? Is this player going to unseat? Maybe Juju Smith-Schuster going from year 1 to year 2. What is that going to look like? So that's how you kind of unearth some of these sleeper picks. I'll give you one right off the bat. I don't have the analytics in front of me. They're in the book. But a guy like Brandon Cooks leaving the LA Rams, a guy like Josh Reynolds, if he ends up winning kind of that other receiver role, if he ends up playing where Brandon Cooks is playing, he's going to have a lot more value. People are going to be paying more attention to Robert Woods and Cooper Kupp, rightfully so. Josh Reynolds might have nice value deep in your draft. And again, that's just off the top of my head. And let me tell you something. By the time it's August or September and you're in your fantasy football drafts, that's probably going to be reported. If you're looking for more mathematically driven sleepers, again, it's the Fantasy Football Almanac and Draft Guide. Lots of math goes in behind this. Proprietary, premium fantasy football analytics, the kind of stuff you'd get from a daily fantasy website that you'd subscribe to. That's all driving this. I isolate matchups and strength of schedule throughout the season per player, not per position group, but per player. So, like I said, it's very intense. It's obsessive compulsive. It is weird, but for fantasy football players, it's actually pretty critical, especially if you're in these high value leagues and you're looking for an edge, finding that extra sleeper or two. Darren Waller, I told everybody to draft Darren Waller in the last round of the drafts last year. 2 years ago, I said, hey, this Le'Veon Bell situation is getting weird. James Conner, he's not being drafted high enough. I actually got him in the last round of my drafts. I told everybody to draft in the last round of their drafts. If you can find a starting running back in the 15th round or whatever it is, isn't that worth it? Isn't that worth the price of admission? And you don't really find those in the widely distributed sites because, again, they all kind of go around hive mind. You need math and you need scouting. And if you don't have the time for it, buy a guide like mine. And if you do, then there are some great resources. I love Fantasy Pros. I love Team Rankings. I love Pro Football Reference. Those are all the statistical things, but nothing takes the place of watching film, watching preseason games. I go through the pain of watching every single preseason game, and it is painful. It is painful to watch all that, but I go through that pain to put value in the almanac. So there you go. There are my my kind of different ways that I find my sleepers. Hope you find that useful. And once again, you can find the Fantasy Football Almanac and Draft Guide available on Amazon.com. Just click the link below. Thanks, everyone.